Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a podcast and it has been for some years. In this podcast, we discuss the topic of designing better miniature games. And Glenn Dunn designed a corker. So we are going to talk again about Pukeapocalypse. I'm not sure what the correct accent to say Pukeapocalypse. I would show you a copy. I would show you my copy, but it green screens to weirdness and back. So that's strange. Why did they print it in this transparent format? Last week we spoke about the game and what it is and how you play it and what miniatures you need and so forth. But I'm curious, Glenn. This is your first time working with a publisher for a war game.
Mm-hmm.
And a rather saucy, sexy publisher because it's Exalted Funeral. They have a spiky logo and
Mm-hmm.
lots of extremely colourful games, of which yours is now one of. So I wanted to ask you some questions first about sort of how the game came about and how the relationship with Exalted Funeral started and how it worked. And then I guess also about how the sort of theme and world emerged.
Yeah, somebody on our Discord, I think it was Alexi who won the One Box War Game Challenge.
Congratulations, sir.
Mightily congratulations to him. Very, very well deserved. Really, really good looking games he's put together. I think he's got the artistic and graphic design thing as well as the game design chops, which I'm very, very jealous of.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
he mentioned that he had, I think, sort of been doing a thing with Exalted Funeral, but like he had for various reasons lost the time to complete it. Was sort of going back to them to see if they were sort of still interested. Like I believe they are. And I was like, oh, Exalted Funeral are taking pitches for minis games. I'll swing by and pitch Exalted Funeral a
Tell
minis
me
game.
more. Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of opened up their website. I've obviously been by there a few times, but I was like, oh, how can do they have a corporate ethos that I might be able to like approach what will be in their range and whatever.
Right.
And a
This is
lot of the time
little
for
pitching
me,
101 here, people.
yes,
Examine
very,
the product catalog of the
yeah, and a lot of the
publisher or
time,
company.
yeah, a lot of the time with minis games like publishers, I do that, and it feels like what they kind of want is something in a historic-y kind of a range, and I'm like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm terrible at historicals, and I
Mm-hmm.
sort of slope off and say, would you like a sci-fi or a horror game? And they go, no, not really.
Mm.
But Exalted Funeral, like if you open their website, there's a very strong sort of like, it's very neon, it's very punk. A lot of their games are sort of weird fantasy sci-fi mashups or whatever. So I was like, okay, I think these are people I could absolutely talk to. Um, and I was looking at sort of the, like I say, a very sort of punk aesthetic to their website.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, something sort of like jaggedy and punk and neon. And I'd been thinking for ages, and this is a slightly sort of obtuse thing, but Dungeon Degenerates by Sean Aberg. Ages ago, I saw an interview with him
Oh
where
yeah.
he talked about the fact that one of the main inspirations for Dungeon Degenerates was an episode of the first series of Blackadder
Oh yeah.
called The Witch Smeller Pursuivant. And he loved the idea of a witch smeller, like a really rubbish. He's not a witch finder. He's not like he. It's just an awful sort of weird ability that this freakish outsider has got, and because of it, he has to sort of live a certain way, and that's why a lot of the characters in Dungeon Degenerates have these really weird, useless, but like entirely defining abilities to them.
Mm.
And I was sort of thinking like, okay, well, I'd like to do something like with a similar set of ideas. These are weirdo outsiders who have like very specific weird ability sets,
Mm.
and had the sort of the idea of punk stuck in my head, and I had the idea of a sort of kung fu monk who like the flow, instead of like with Avatar where they have the power to control water or flame or a useful element of that kind, the element that he was able to control was puke, was vomit. Also partly because like puke monk is like the punk but with extra letters in the middle. And so I was like, okay, so there's this puke monk and he controls like the flow of vom within the chi of people, and he's a punk and he lives in this sort of weird neon world. And it's like, well, you know, that made me think of the old David Carradine series Kung Fu, where this guy sort of wanders from place to place in a sort of, I think it's like the Wild West, but in a quite sort of desolate landscape. So that was so then it was going to be like a post-apocalyptic. And what do I want my sort of weird punk post-apocalypse to be? I want it to be a really sort of rubbish apocalypse. Also, like a lot of the time with post-apocalyptic stuff, I look at it and I go, I think I could quite go for living in that world. That looks all right. I'm not sure that this is an apocalypse. I think this is just a different and rather more fun way of living, like you know, living on into the future. Like a lot of the early Mad
You
Max.
mean ones where there's just like quite a lot of outdoor camping and stuff?
Yeah, you know, and riding around and like not like being needing to worry about going to a 9 to 5 job or anything. And like it made me think a lot about there's a manga of bucket list, I think Zon 100 Bucket List of the Dead. It's about there's a zombie apocalypse and it's the best thing that ever happened to this guy because he can like go out and do all the things he's ever wanted and like, you know, fulfill his own bucket list by like going to amazing places and doing great things. I was like, okay, well, I want this to be an apocalypse which is not ongoing. It is an apocalypse as in at the end of this apocalypse there will be no living thing like humans left on the planet. And so that's where the idea of the Pukeapocalypse being this thing where, okay, there's literally like everyone has about 3 or 4 months left to live because they're melting through with this puke because of the puke monk. And so puke was going to be like the weapon in the game. And I had this, as I said earlier, this idea of the token like mechanic hanging around. So at that point I had this sort of quite formed world. I had a mechanic that I was fairly certain would work for it, and the sort of the punk
So the physical pushing tokens thing, that did that float abstractly out some time earlier, or was it originally attached to something else?
Yeah, what I'd had this idea for sort of laying tokens around as a sort of force projection template thing on the tabletop. I think it came from when I was fiddling around with an idea for a superhero game.
Oh right, yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, well, this might be a way to be like, you know, telekinetic powers or something, and also like, okay, and then I can use those things to like lay mines or something like that, and then the superhero game ended up sort of being something else, and that
and we talk a lot about templates, and like we were enjoying that red what was it called, red bush, red main, redwood, the one with the
redwood.
Redwood. Sorry,
Yes, because of the trees, because it's in the forest.
Redwood. Yeah.
Redwood.
But like templates are nice, but they're like all a specific size and you can't slot them in the way that like the gaps between miniatures are often kind of fiddly. And so, yeah, I guess that idea of progressively building a template out of Lego blocks, it's cool.
Yeah, so I went so I had this idea, so this sort of a world and the characters and the setting and this punk thing. I knew I wanted it to be very sort of British in its ethos and its sense of humor. And I had a sort of a mechanic system that I'm pretty sure would work for it. And so on that basis, I went and hit up Exalted Funeral, confidently stating that I had a draft set of rules that I could get to them. You know,
lying bastard.
once I had like
there's a draft in my head. It just hasn't come out onto paper yet.
Yeah. Well, I had a thing on paper that was a completely different rule set, which was probably going to work for
it. Got them on a technicality.
but realistically, it didn't actually exist at the point where I pitched it to them. But I was 90% sure that I could knock it out in like a month or two. And so yeah, hitting them up for a pitch meeting, and they were keen to to hear a pitch. They were up for doing more minis games. I think they generally want to sort of extend out. They've got a lot of RPGs, but I think they want to extend out and do more minis games. So I went into this, set up a pitch meeting with them, a multi-way Zoom call, and as I said a few times, the very early on, I sort of pitched it as the moment in the original RoboCop movie where Emil Zabronsky falls in the toxic waste tank and then is crawling out and then gets hit by a car and just bursts all over the windscreen of the oncoming car. And at that point, they said, "Okay, well, this is sold. We're booked for like another half hour of a pitch meeting, and let's talk and get excited about it." But yeah, we'll sign that up. That sounds great. Yeah, we had a lovely conversation, and I said, okay, well, I'll have a draft to you, in about a month. And yeah, they signed on and agreed to it. I spent a month furiously writing a draft that about hung together, which changed significantly over the following months of development and whatnot. But was in its core was the game that ended up being. Yeah, and got it signed up, and it's been absolutely fantastic.
That's awesome. What's cool is that you kind of you reacted to, you spotted an opportunity, you saw what the sort of flavor of the opportunity was, and then you had enough things in your notebook, enough sort of things that you had been thinking about that when the moment struck, it wasn't oh, I've got to come up with something. It's just well, let me just cherry pick a couple of these tasty and tidy ideas because I can make this into a lovely stew.
I mean, what's been so great? A lot of things have been great working with Exalted Funeral, but one of the things for me that's been great is that, like I say, several times I've gone to pitch to minis companies, minis games publishers, and you sort of look at their front page and their catalog, and you go, well, what's your identity? What are you into? What's your thing? And it's a bit like, I don't know. You're not a lot of the time I don't feel like they're giving me much to react to. And I say, oh, are you open for a pitch? And a lot of them go, yeah, sure. Wow us with whatever your best thing is. And I'm very much like, I've got 20 things, I could fit. I can actually fit into your catalog. Tell me what you want.
Right.
And what was great for me with Exalted Funeral was just looking at the front page of their website told me what they wanted.
Yeah.
And I was like, great, because I want to work to a brief because I have enough things to fit into different briefs. I don't have one darling that I'm insanely enthusiastic over. I want to be able to sort of
go. And you're also not a one note sort of person who just only wants to make one kind of thing. You're you're excited to make a variety of things.
Yeah. So yeah, really, the opportunity was the fact that they are so clear in their, who they are and what they're doing and what sorts of things they want to sort of put out into the world. And I was just able to sort of bounce off and react to that. And then once we got got it sort of signed up and sorted out, we went out and found some artists, and they came up with a list of names and people. And Lucas, who did this and the cover art and whatnot, instantly leapt out as yeah, this is perfect. He had all of his stuff. It was just screaming that he wanted to do something like Pukeapocalypse already, and he got it instantly. I wrote a brief and a thing of explaining the world, etc., and he was just right away. And I a few times with a couple of the other artists, I had to go into a bit more detail of explaining kind of what the world is, and I didn't need to with Lucas. He was just he was already there. He was ahead of me on half the stuff, and it's been great collaborating with him and with all the artists, Caustic and Tiger Wizard, the other two artists on it. That partly because it's not a game that I've been living with for the last 3 or 4 years in a world I've been carefully crafting. It'd been great working with them because they have realized the world as much as I have.
Right.
You know, they sort of defined bits of it, and I've seen bits of artwork and been like, okay, well that's sort of going into this bit of background, you know, and it's not like heavy on background, but every now and again I see a thing and I'm like, okay, I'm going to stick that in. That's going to be an item. That's going to be a description of an ability. Um, and yeah, and they've all been absolutely fantastic to work with. So so Tiger Wizard, who did a handful of the bits of the artwork, was also the developer
Mm.
on the game, and that was one of the things.
What a treat getting a developer.
I know that was one of the things that was absolutely fantastic with working with Exalted Funeral, and a reason to recommend them is they gave me a full-time developer, and you know we worked through the game in like Google Docs and whatever, and you know he went through on sort of like clarity issues and feedback, and that was just absolutely amazing to have somebody who, you know, was reading it as an outsider, because it's like that is such a valuable thing to have somebody going, oh, I don't think this is a super clear way of wording it.
Mm.
And he was all on top of the like inconsistent wording bits, and like, you
Mm.
know, oh, you use this there and that there, and you've you
Mm.
know capitalized this at this point and not at that point. So he's absolutely been brilliant. um yeah, and we sort of, you know, worked through it and put it together, and yeah, Exalted Funeral have been absolutely fantastic to work with all the way through. um like I say, they sort of they got straight into the feel of the world and the place, and the way I wanted to do it, and the way that the whole product wanted to be as well, because they've been great
Yeah.
on like the whole product design thing. There's a little, they came up with the idea of having a little bath bag in there to carry the tokens around in, and you know, yeah, so it's been
Yeah, some
absolutely
nice
excellent.
details. So you started mentioning a bit of like the world building and how it was sort of shared. So I guess I'm curious about a couple of things. One is, how did you approach world building with a capital W in this game? Like, where did you put it? How much, like, how much stuff did you want to put up front versus burying it in item descriptions and stuff? And then, like, how did you visit it in your mind? Like, how did it grow? Like, yeah, like how did it grow in your imagination? Like, what was the process for doing that?
So it came, first of all, from the factions.
Mm.
um I decided early on that I wanted each of the factions to be based on a genre of punk music, like
Right.
at least in my head as I was starting.
Mm.
And so the different factions are based on like, you know, obviously the skinless skins are obviously, you know, skinheads.
Mm.
The straight edges obviously named for straight edge punk.
Mm-hmm.
um but one of the things about Pukeapocalypse is it's very British in its humor, and I don't know how much this particular tendency translates like around the world and in the US or whatever, but we have a great tradition of like end of the pier naughty postcard, like double entendres, and you know, cheap toilet humor in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the straight edges, although they're named for the punk straight edges, they're basement dwelling like weirdos who are protected by the lead paint in their, you know, basement parents' house that they've been living in, and they sort of crawl out of the basements after the apocalypse. And so their edging is not the straight edging.
Yes, they are heterosexual. It's
um
funny joke. I like.
and then the Queen sisters were originally named queer sisters, which is based on another old English joke where in English law we have what are now King's Council, that are like DAs, I guess, in the US, and they used to obviously be called Queen's Councils, so they were QCs, and they used to be like a joke of that they're QCs because they're queer customers, they're not to be trusted, they're a little bit sort of odd and weird. and I wanted them to be sort of referencing punk queercore music. Exalted Funeral, like, okay, queer is a bit of a sort of controversial word, so I took it back to Queens because that was like the original basis for it, and their sisters, as in cyst, as in like disease and puke and whatnot. And all of the abilities of the Queen sisters are named by terms from Polari, which is a obscure British slang used by the homosexual community during the point where it was illegal to be homosexual in Britain. And so they had a specific slang so they could talk to each other whilst like in front of authority. And that's another way of referencing the subversion of authority of punk and etc. etc. And so what are now the Doggers were originally based on the Riot Girls because of just the word "grr," and so originally that I think they were named the Girls, and the response from Exalted Funeral, which is entirely fair, that it's like being a feminist and being all hairy and animalistic is not okay. I was like, oh yeah, it didn't occur to me. And so they got renamed the Doggers, which also therefore gives a great opportunity for a whole bunch of other awful innuendos and cheap toilet humor jokes for them. And then the psychobillies are an obvious, one where they obviously have psychic powers and they are into psychobilly rock. So then there's this sort of these bunch
That's probably my favorite illustration of the faction illustrations.
Oh yeah, that was
with the 50s haircut and the massive forehead.
Well, that again, that funny enough was
he feels like straight out of 2000 AD. I can even think of the Judge Dredd strip that's got that guy in.
No, yeah, very much so. I think there's a few of them, and like I built I did like a mood board of references, and there was a good bit of like the psychedelic period of 2000 AD in that. And actually that was from like one of the guys from Exalted Funeral. When I said psychobillies, he said, yeah, because they've got like the pompadour quiffs, but their head just carries on with it, and it's like, okay, yeah, we'll tell that to the artist, and that's gonna be got to be what that was. And he gets to use like one of the comically enormous end of the pier like novelty combs, like legitimately.
Yeah.
So yes, then there was this collection of like weirdos and outsiders and oddballs that were very sort of defined by a British ethos, a British, underground movement. And so then, there was this sort of weird, grimy version of an apocalypse, a set of people with a very definite sort of ethos and way of looking at the world. And then, they obviously had to all gather together in Milton Keynes and be trying to beat each other to death for buckets.
I wonder if that gag translates or travels rather.
I'm certain it doesn't, but this is one of the things about writing it is several times I'm like, this gag isn't going to travel even a little bit.
I think you just got to trust people to
and it just does not matter. And hopefully there's like just things in there that people can dig down into, like including Polari slang. It's like I really hope people like look that up and learn about a sort of weird, fascinating sort of corner of of culture, and a thing that I've always found a really fascinating and an interesting area of like rebellion and revolution against authority. Because it's like as a kid I remember listening to there's a show called Round the Horn, which was a radio show that we used to have in Britain, and there were a couple of characters on there who spoke in Polari, and it was on the BBC it was this really sort of open but rebellious and underground thing that they were like doing. This thing was talking about a thing that was still sort of if not illegal, very much taboo. And families and nanas listened to it and laughed uproariously. And I just that whole thing of like the bits of a lot of my youth was
I still
reading.
listen to Rambling Sid Rumpo fairly regularly.
Yeah, it's like looking back, like a lot of the comic books and culture and movies and things that I was exposed to as a kid were very sort of subversive, and it's like 2000 AD immensely subversive. Like GW back in the sort of in the 80s had a lot of really genuinely satirical, weird, subversive content in it. It's like there was a comic book I read when I was young called Toxic. And the thing is, back in the 80s, like news agents had no concept of a comic book that shouldn't be shelved with all the other
Right,
comic
for children,
kids
yeah.
comic books. And there was a British comic book called Toxic, which absolutely should never have been allowed to be in the range of any child. It was deeply disturbing, really. And it's like I looked it up on Wikipedia just recently. Like, was this just a fever dream? And it's like I think it was Dan Morrison. But it was next 2080 artist who wanted to bring out a comic book that was so clearly for only for grown-ups that it would
Right.
like break the idea of comic books being something that wasn't for adults. And my parents in all innocence bought me this, brightly colored thing, which was just the most vile murder and dismemberment and horror that that you could ever sort of come across. And it was like, I want to bring a lot of that sort of subversion in, you know, um, in everyday life back again a bit with Pukeapocalypse. So it was trying to do that as much as possible and go like, let's have a bit more fun. And like I say, it was so weird that I put this together, obviously worked on it for whatever it ended up being like, 9 months a year, with no idea that they were going to do the new Toxic Avenger movie.
Oh yeah.
And then that came, and then I was just saw a trailer like a few weeks ago come up for Street Trash, which was one of the Melt movies, was very much like an inspiration for a lot of the idea of Pukeapocalypse, and they've just remade Street Trash, and it's like, okay, well, I
Right,
guess this is
zeitgeist.
this is the thing that's in the zeitgeist. Then this is out there and it's around, so maybe it's just the right time for it.
Well, hopefully it is the right time and people will pick it up. If you are watching this podcast, I'm assuming that you've already checked out the Exalted Funeral website and clicked around to see if you can acquire a copy of Pukeapocalypse in your geological region. Um, if you want to get set up, like it's only 5 minis aside. You just need like a 2 foot square. I think it's two. Is it 2 foot? It's 2 foot, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 2 foot. 2 foot square is the way for the future.
Yeah, and the terrain requirements are fairly like you don't need that. It's not like a game with loads of shooting where you need to have tons of terrain.
No, absolutely. It's nice to have a couple of bits of elevation so that people can get pushed off them
Yeah,
and
so
burst.
people can fall off stuff.
Yes, but it's like it really it doesn't care too much about it. There is no line of sight because there's shooting, and most terrain is just designated a thing that you sort of smush through.
Yeah.
So yeah, it should be pretty easy to get onto the tabletop for people, and it's got all the bits and pieces that you need to play included. In
All the
the
tokens and measuring widgets and whatnot.
yeah, you've got all your puke tokens and your first player tokens and a measuring widget that will do every piece of measuring that you need to do. So you literally just need a fistful of dice, minis and terrain, and the book, and you can play it. So
Nice.
yes, so hopefully people will pick up a copy. Like I say,
You pick it up now.
yeah, there'll be links in the down belows to Exalted Funeral, and if you're in the UK, there'll be a link to my website so you can save some shipping by ordering it from there. And we should be having it at Salute in probably like a month, 2 months from when this video goes out. That's coming up fast.
Yeah.
we need to get prepared. We'll have it at Salute. We'll have it at UKG. Please do come by and say hello if you're in
Yes.
the UK and you're going to Salute the Minis convention. Other than that, like, okay, people swing down into the comments section and tell me what you think about what weirdly subversive, clearly too old for you thing did you encounter as a wee sprogling. What sort of thing that made a terrible impact upon your.
What snuck under your parents' radar?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to know because, like I say, like thinking through Pukeapocalypse, I was just like, oh my god, I should never have like watched that movie. I shouldn't have been watching Toxic because there's a Toxic Avenger cartoon show. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh
There's like
God,
a
I do
Saturday
remember that.
morning Toxic Avenger cartoon show that I loved as a kid, and I
Wow, deep memory unlock.
and then I, as a small child, saw like that Toxic Avenger the movie was like on TV late at night.
Right, so that just must be a kids' movie. Great.
So yeah, absolutely, it's probably the same thing. I knew how to work the video the video recorder, and pretty much nobody else in the house did. So I set it to record and sat down and watched it in the afternoon. And it's like, yeah, I should have been watching that at like 10 years old. That wasn't okay. um, as you were down there, like reporting these scarring but strengthening moments, please do hit the like and subscribe. Like I say, swing across the website, pick up Pukeapocalypse or something else that we've done to support the channel. If you've already got it, go down and join one or other or both of our Patreons to support the channel, and jump over to the Discord and tell us that you have done these things, and we will call you friends and brothers in arms. But for now, I think from this episode of Rule of Carnage, it's to be a thank you and goodbye. So, thank you and goodbye.